Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's always honored to rise in this chamber. And we've been discussing very, very profound issues today. Perhaps some of the most profound issues we can ever discuss in Parliament, which is life and death of loved ones and death of those who have no one to love them. And yet, this is all happening in context of Bill C-39, which absolutely fails the test of profundity because it's a last-minute scramble. It's a papering over of absolute failure to deal with something that should have been dealt with from the beginning, and the government continues to drop the ball. So I'm going to speak a bit of how we got here, and I will say that it is really important in this debate to be careful with the language we use and to be careful with each other. Because I've heard it's alluded as though this was some kind of Nazi regime, which is ridiculous. I've heard people talk about being loved and other people saying, well, this isn't, we're not respecting rights. We're talking about the most intimate acts that a human experiences: birth and death. And it may sound odd to say that death is an intimate act. Death can be very traumatic. Death can be violent. Death can really tear families apart, but it can also bring families together. And it's those moments of how we confront death and value death that really shows who we are as a society. I'm thinking right now of my sister Kathleen, who never made it out of her 50s. This week would have been her birthday. And man, nobody got a rawer deal in life than my sister. She got the bad end of the cards dealt to her every single time. And Doc Holliday had nothing on her when it came to facing down death. And I remember as she was dying, and every morning she insisted that she looked good, and her back was disintegrating from the cancer. And one of us got the nerve to ask her about MAID. Man, she almost bit our head off, because that will to live, the will to be there one more day through the pain, was very, very profound. And I remember we set her off singing Danny Boy, because that's how we say goodbye. And that's how we said goodbye to her husband when he died, just before her, and my dad and my grandfather. And those are intimate moments. But her death, and a natural death it was, wasn't somehow superior to people who've also chosen MAID. I think of my friend Liz from Vancouver Island. Wow, she was a force. She called me and said, I can't live with the pain anymore, and I'm choosing the date. I spoke to her the day before she went. And I had a sense that that was also a very profound moment. I think of my friend Craig from CBC, and I followed his last 2 weeks on Facebook, because every day he posted. And it was a very powerful thing to see someone choose that moment and choose how they were going to tell their story in those final 2 weeks. So the choices that people make, we have to respect. And I think that the provision for MAID that was brought in was about ensuring that a fundamental respect was given. But I think the flaw goes back to the fact that we are not just individuals. We're not just individuals with rights. We are brothers, fathers, uncles, sisters, aunts. We have come from family, and family is part of it, because death without family is traumatic. That is a tearing apart. We come from communities, and a death in our communities can be traumatic if we are not part of it. We come from neighborhoods. I think of my father when he died, and they lived up in a townhouse project in North Scarborough, and the neighbors were coming all hours of the day and night. Sri Lankan, Italian, South Asian families who couldn't speak English but said, we brought food for Mr. John, because he was part of the neighborhood. And so those moments of death are about our involvement with each other. And what concerns me with the changes that have been suggested to MAID is about separating those who are vulnerable, those who are isolated, those with mental distress, from the larger community that needs to hold them and care for them. And we as legislators can't just say, well, it's an individual choice. This is a societal choice we're making, and we're making it now on behalf of very vulnerable people who need our back. Who we can't just say, well, they're depressed. They've always been depressed. It's their right, they're individuals. That's a failure of our obligation to be there as neighborhood, as community, as family, to hold them and to get them through the darkness. So I said, how did we get here? Well, there's a lot of blame, enough blame to go around. We knew that the issue of medical assistance and dying was fundamentally an issue that Parliament had to confront. This was our job as legislators. It was a hard job, but it was our job. And the Stephen Harper government just decided to ignore it. They did nothing on this, even though we all knew this was coming. So then the Carter decision came down. The Supreme Court stepped in, and I think it was a failure for the courts to step in and do the job of what parliamentarians should have done. And what they did was they put a timeline because they said they didn't have faith in Parliament. And it was also, I think, a mistake that the Supreme Court put such a short timeline because these were profound decisions we were making. So the original bill passed, and I had a lot of questions about that bill. I had real concerns about what were the protections. How would it be implemented? When we talk about someone whose death is foreseeable, who's suffering from pain that they cannot deal with, how do we make sure that that the legislation is not opening the door to something much broader? And we were told at the time as parliamentarians, vote for the legislation and we will have a review. And I trusted that. I thought, well, that's fair. I have a lot of questions, but I recognize there are legal obligations. We have the Supreme Court's ruled, and Parliament will have a chance to look at this. And we never were given that opportunity. Parliament was never given the right to see the effects of the legislation we brought in. And then the Truchon decision came in, which said, a Quebec court said that the charter provisions limiting it to a foreseeable death wasn't fair, and we had to throw the legislation out. That would have been a time, I think it would have been reasonable for the federal government to have brought that to the Supreme Court and asked for a review. And they didn't do that. They accepted it. And I think of that because I think of how many decisions went in favor of Indigenous communities and government went all the way to the Supreme Court every single time. But on the Truchon decision, they didn't. So there was another opportunity to say, this legislation is being expanded, perhaps for good, perhaps for bad, but it needs to be reviewed. And still Parliament didn't get that chance to do the review. And then it went to the Senate. Of all places, the unelected, unaccountable Senate, people who can't be fired once they're hired, they can do whatever they want, they can show up or not show up, and they sent us back a bill that said, we want Parliament, the elected members, to approve our change, which is that if you're depressed, you should be able to die. The government should have rejected that bill outright. Should have told the Senate, number one, you're not elected, you're not accountable, and this is a ridiculous provision, and they didn't. And so it sat on the Attorney General's desk with a coming into effect for St. Patrick's Day coming up. And so now we're scrambling. We're scrambling. We have to deal with this bill. But it's not that we're responding to the bill. We're saying, well, let's put it off for another year. So I'll support that. But I think that is a complete failure of our obligation to deal with something that needs to be reflected on and needs a profound answer from parliamentarians. It needs us to stand up and say what is right and what is fair and what provisions have to be in place to protect the vulnerable, particularly those who in a moment of darkness think, I want to just end my life. And I looked at the statistics of how MAID has been applied, and that alone would cause, I think, any parliamentarian to say, yeah, we should look at this. 1,200 people died from MAID in 2016. It more than doubled in 2017. It more than doubled again in 2018 to over 5,000. and over 10,950 in 2021. That's 30 people every single day in this country deciding to end their life. 30 people a day. That's double from all the deaths from breast cancer in this nation. Double. And it is more than double the national suicide rate. And we're not going to reflect and say, wait a minute, is this opening the door to a place that we shouldn't have gone and then none of us thought we were going? When more than double the deaths in this country are from people going to the doctor and saying, I just don't want to be here anymore, than what we see in the suicide epidemic? You know, we could be told that there's protections and measurements in place, and we have been told that. I heard that at all the hearings. You know, and then we get examples, and I don't want to, you know, wave around one example and say this is proof of what went wrong and why the government is the perfidy of this government. But I look at an Associated Press article on Ian Nicholas, who had a history of depression and mental illness, and the police brought him to the hospital because they were afraid he was going to kill himself. And his family said, we got to help him. He's got a history of mental illness. And he decided to apply for MAID, and he was dead. That's an outrage. His family were asking for help for him. But he was treated as an individual in his own right who could just come into the hospital, brought in by the police who were trying to keep him alive. And I think of the suicide rates that we've had in the communities I represent. Some of the highest suicide rates in the world are in northern Canada. And we've done jack about that. You know? In 2019, I brought motion 174 to this House, calling for a national suicide prevention action plan. And every single member of the House voted for that. And everyone, I heard all the speeches. You know, we have to protect the vulnerable. We're going to be there for them. Government has a role to play. We voted for that, and nothing was done. Nothing. And people continued to die. So now we have this legislation, the panic legislation, to say, oh my God, let's just put off for another year the fact that all you have to do is be depressed and you can walk in and say, I want to die, and they'll let you die. You could be depressed for all manner of reasons. In Belgium, which has had medically assisted suicide for many years, you can claim it for PTSD. My God, PTSD. Will that be a reason for it? Depression. Injury at work. Yeah, you got a crappy life. If you've got serious chronic pain, you're going to have a crappy life, especially if you're not going to get a proper pension, especially if you don't have a proper place to live. But you will be able to go as an individual and say, I want to die. And we're going to let that happen on our watch? I don't think so. And again, this isn't about my moral choices over someone else's moral choices. This is about who we are as a society and who we protect and who we leave on the sidelines. So, you know, in M174, to establish the National Suicide Prevention Action Plan, there were many, many factors that we brought in because we met with organizations across the country because we talked about what would it take to have a holistic, life-supporting system for people in crisis. That we'd establish the national guidelines for best practices in suicide prevention based on the evidence and effectiveness in a Canadian context, so we would know. That we would work to establish the culturally appropriate community-based suicide prevention programs by the representative organizations of the Inuit, First Nation, and Métis people so that they ran the programs that worked for them, so they were culturally appropriate. That would create a national public health monitoring program for the prevention of suicide and the identification of groups at elevated risk. And that's really, really important. Because when you know where the elevated risks are, you know where to put resources. The creation of programs to identify and fill gaps in knowledge relating to suicide and its prevention, including timely and accurate statistical data. Once again, if you don't know what the data looks like, you have no way to help. It's not the role of the government to go in and do emergency crisis prevention in every single case. That's not what we do, and we'll be terrible at it. But it's that information, it's the analysis, and being able to show where the shortfalls are that allows funding to flow. The creation of the National Online Hub, providing essential information in assessing the programs in the various languages, English, French, Indigenous, and also the other languages spoken in Canada. In conducting, within 18 months, a comprehensive analysis of high-risk groups of people and the risk factors specific to each group, and the degree to which sexual abuse and other forms of childhood abuse and neglect have an impact on suicidal behavior. To assess the barriers to Canadians assessing appropriate and adequate health, wellness, and recovery services, including substance use, addiction, and bereavement services, and the funding arrangements required to provide treatment, education, professional training, and other supports required to prevent suicide and assist those bereaved by a loved one's suicide. The use of culturally appropriate suicide prevention activities and best practices, and to study the role that social media plays with respect to suicide and suicide prevention. Government had done that, then yeah, you can come in and tell me you're going to pass this Senate bill allowing people who are mentally depressed to kill themselves. Because you could tell me that you've actually done the analysis, you've presented to Parliament the information, and we've looked at this, and we know where the gaps are. But if you haven't done any of that work, don't tell me we're going to pass a bill that'll let someone who has no support, no backup, no help, to say, well, yeah, life's tough, pal, too bad. It's game over for you. And this was the final thing that we voted for in this Parliament. We stood up, and I know a lot of people are getting their pictures on this and putting up press releases about how great it was. We were standing up on suicide prevention. The annual report to Parliament on preparations for and implementation of the National Action Plan for Suicide Prevention, including data on progress over the previous year, and a comprehensive statistical overview of suicide in Canada for the year. So if we had done that in 2019, and we had 4 years of statistics, and we had facts, and we knew where the mental health dollars were needed to go, we weren't just putting it out willy-nilly, but we actually had statistics, then we could talk about, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe in certain circumstances, after all these other areas have been exhausted, after all these other supports have failed, a person may have no other choice. But that person in the midst of darkness today has none of those other supports because nobody at the federal level bothered to put that in place. And we've seen our provincial governments fail on so many areas as well. And I want to say I was really deeply concerned when I heard the Attorney General do a podcast on this legislation. And he deliberately connected the change of MAID to the right to kill yourself. He said, remember that suicide generally is available to people, and this is a group, meaning the people who might need aid, made within the population who for physical reasons and possibly mental reasons can't make the choice themselves to do it. And ultimately, this provides a more humane way for them to make a decision they otherwise could have made if they were able to do it in some other way. That's the Attorney General of Canada saying, yeah, they physically can't do it, they might not be smart enough to do it, they might be too depressed, but they have a right to kill themselves. That was what he said on a podcast just recently. So when I'm told we're going to delay this for a year, yeah, I'll vote to delay it for a year, but I want to see a plan about to address this. I want to see the statistics that prove how this is being used and if it's being exploited and if the vulnerable are being targeted or being led to use this because there are no other supports. And until that, the last thing we do as a Parliament of Canada is open the door further for more people to die.